My name's Ian Reid and I'm the Deputy Head of Emergency Management for Lincolnshire County Council. And on behalf of the Council, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and present to you today on some of the work that Lincolnshire have been doing over the last 2 years on our coastal flooding threat. It is the number 2 threat to the county, so as you can imagine it's very important to us. And we've had quite a lot of research done over the last couple of years with partners from 3 universities and a couple of other organisations as well. And that's really covered our rescue capabilities, vulnerable people, the caravan sites, and we've used some thermal imagery which I'll show you later on, and some road research. When you're getting several different organisations together to undertake research, there can be several interpretations of data. For example, in the UK, there's no national definition for what a property is, for instance, and in flooding that's quite, it presents us with a bit of a challenge. Does it include caravans, of which in our county, and again I'll cover later, we've got quite a few of? Does it take into account multiple occupancy, blocks of flats, businesses, factories, all sorts of things? So for that reason, we've really gone with the Environment Agency data set and their 1 in 200 and 1 in 1,000 year threat work, their flood hazard mapping work, really because it takes into account velocity of water, depth and the topography of water as well, and that was more applicable for what we wanted to do. So I must say, sort of now, therefore the research and some of the things that I'm going to say is indicative only because it's taken into account that one thing. And again, I'm a planner and not a data manager, so that's my excuse for the technical questions later on. So over the next 20-25 minutes, I want to just cover some background, tell you a little bit about our shared ambition, a bit about the communications campaign that we undertook with the communities that are on our coastline, something about the road strategies, something about hidden communities, and that's where some of the caravan work comes in, convergent volunteers, I'll cover some vulnerable people, an exercise watermark, which was a large exercise in the country last year, in the UK last year, but we used it to underpin everything that we'd done with our research and see if it actually worked in practice. And then some next steps. We have an East Coast inundation group that's set up and looks at this project. And basically one of the straplines that we use in the county is that we're prepared for coastal flooding in Lincolnshire, are you? And again, I'll cover that in more detail about the work that we did with the local communities. And again, basically we want to make our communities more resilient because we aren't going to be able to help everybody, and again I'll cover that in my presentation later on, but we want to make them more resilient and encourage them to help themselves and look at self-evacuating in times of flooding emergencies. This is a map that you can see here. It's actually a historical map of the 53 floods, which was the last major flooding that affected the whole of the East Coast, and a colleague here from Essex as well had faced some of the same problems that we did. But loss of life, we had massive challenges, people lost their properties, lots of agricultural land was not usable for lots of time afterwards. So again, it's our second highest risk and it's something that we need to plan for. In this area now, we've got 72,000 households, as you can see. Increasing the elderly population, it is a tourist county, so people tend to come from other areas in the UK, come on holiday to Lincolnshire, onto the East Coast, been doing it all their lives, and then they want to retire to where they had such nice times on holiday. That's my tourist bit for Lincolnshire. 24,000 static caravans. Probably one of the largest amounts of caravans in Europe, or so they say. And it looks fairly white from the air in Lincolnshire at the moment, as the weather's the same here, but it always looks fairly white on the East Coast in Lincolnshire because of the amount of caravans that you can see. And most of those are people that are probably not too familiar with the area. Certainly when they come on the holidays are not bothered about what the flood risk is in the main, but we do need to take into account those. But most of our help in times of emergency and flooding is going to fall into 3 categories really. Those that can't go, and by that I mean people that will need our assistance to move for whatever reason, people that don't have their own transport that would rely on us to get transportation. Those that won't go and we still have lots of people to say, well, I've been here before, the water's got to this height and nothing's ever happened, so I'm going to take my chances. That still happens. And those that actually don't know, I touched on it earlier on when I said that some people are on holiday, some people are just here for a couple of weeks, they don't know what the threat is, they don't know what the consequences are, and so we need to spend some time looking at that. As well with the county, 20% of the UK food supplies are either produced or packed in the county. You can imagine that if we have large-scale flooding in our county, then there's a knock-on effect to the rest of the UK as well, and the food chain is affected. In this area, 29 schools, 32 care homes. Again, all of those people that would fall into the can't go category and we'd have to assist, and we've got one prison as well. I should say as well in Lincolnshire that local government-wise, it's a two-tier system. So there's a Lincolnshire County Council and then 7 district councils, 3 of which are on the coast. So the East Coast inundation work then, I think our shared ambition is what you see on the slide here. We want Lincolnshire to be a safe place to live, to work and to come on holiday. Our flood defences are better than they've ever been, but we want people to understand that we can't just get rid of that risk altogether. There's always going to be a risk of flooding, and we need people to be prepared and know what to do if we're in times that we have to communicate with them and maybe move them fairly quickly. And there's 7 outcomes really from this ambition that we want to achieve before it's totally succeed. So the first one's fairly obvious. It's our number 2 risk. You would expect us to have planned for it. We need to make sure that we've got our emergency plans. We need to make sure that those emergency plans dovetail with other agencies and that there's clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and that we share those plans as well. And we do this through the Lincolnshire Resilience Forum. In the UK, everybody, each county has a resilience forum. Second one there, coastal communities know what the risk is. And that's when the actual campaign comes in. Again, more of that later. But it's okay that we've got plans and we know pretty much what we'd want to do and how we'd evacuate our local population. But if they don't know and they don't know of the risks, then our plans probably are not going to work and we're setting ourselves up to fail. So that's a big challenge, and it has been a big challenge and an ongoing challenge for us. And again, following on to the third one, that people know what to do when it happens as well. Well practiced. We'd like to be more well practiced, but as you can imagine, actually holding evacuation exercises is not only very resource intensive, it's quite expensive as well. And again, with Exercise Watermark, it was one opportunity that we could do to do that, so we grasped it with both hands. We'd like to be well resourced. We'd always like to be well resourced. We'd all like to be well resourced, and I think a couple of the other speakers have said earlier on today that we're trying to do a lot more for less at the moment, so that's not always the case, but which is why there's as we can be there. And we deliver an integrated response. So as a local resilience forum, we're used to working in a multi-agency setting. We know what our roles and responsibilities, and we know the roles and responsibilities of our partner agencies, and we train and we work together both in times of emergency and in the planning process as well. And we develop best practice. We would say that we are still in a work in progress. We're not quite there yet, which is great that we can come to things like this, because already I've got lots of things that I can take away. Certainly on the social media side, because it's an area that we still need to further develop. So some of the research then that I've looked down here. Coastal community resilience. What we've tried to do in Lincolnshire is to work very closely with our parish councils, because they're the ones with the local resources. They know their local areas. We've encouraged them to write parish plans. Those plans include where local resources are, such as four-wheel drive vehicles, maybe tractors, sand, and they also take into account specialist staff. So you might have doctors, nurses, people that can help in times of emergency. Because what we say is, and again going back to the 3 options that I said before, we'll be helping those 3 categories of people. most people that have got a car on the coastline, we'll be wanting them to self-evacuate and to get themselves away so that we can focus our resources there. And some of the communities are quite isolated on our coastline. We can't be everywhere at once, so we need them to help themselves until we can get emergency services to them. Effective use of roads and evacuation. I've got some slides later on that'll better do that. Again, hidden communities as well. Needs of vulnerable people and assessing the flood risk requirements. Certainly, a lot of the research into our rescue capability enabled us. We had 2 rescue boats in the county. I think we needed around about 63 that we want ideally. We know we're not going to get 63. However, as a result of some of the funding that we've been able to get, we've now got 12, and I think that's a huge step forward for us. And again, when we're looking at national assets, we know what we need, and we can make a bid fairly quickly. And again, you know, other colleagues in the room will be bidding for the same stuff nationally as we will be doing, and we've got a better idea of what we want, and we can get in there early. An exercise watermark truly did test what we had put in place. Bit about the campaign then, and this was one of the strap lines. We're prepared, are you? And you can see some of the pictures that we put as part of this. There are several. There are 4 different pictures, but you can see there's a website there. Make a plan, make a call. The make a plan is templates on how you can make a community plan, where you can get copies of that plan. The make a call really is the Environment Agency's flood line that operates in the UK, where people can register their phone lines, their mobile phone lines, or they can register relatives' numbers, and they're given up-to-date information on flood warnings for their area. So it has 2 links. And this is pretty much what we did. I think that when you're talking about flooding, you can imagine when we're telling people to be prepared for flooding, doesn't always go down too well in those areas, because there's a knock-on effect on, or people are worried that it'll have an effect on tourism. Some of the pictures that we used, we wanted to base them on some of the old-fashioned postcards that were around in the 50s and 60s in the UK. But we had to be really, really careful when we were using churches and all sorts of landmarks, because people were saying, well, that looks like one of our towns, for instance. That looks like Boston, that looks like Skegness. And so we had to be very, very careful and very, very mindful what images we used. But we wanted to make sure that people were aware of the risk without causing too much detraction from tourism and investment in local areas. But you can see that before we undertook this, the baseline surveys, only 7% of people in those areas felt that they were prepared and knew about the risk of flooding. That's pretty bad, really. And as much as we were getting out before, you know, the message was obviously not getting through. So there was a clear need to undertake some research and to do this. We put these posters on bus timetables, bus shelters, leaflets, flood plans, and we posted them through 40,000 homes, which was no mean feat, really. And we put information in businesses and caravan sites. We've got some more ongoing work with caravan sites, because how many of those leaflets actually went to caravan owners, we're not quite sure, but all you can do is give them to the owners. And we use billboards, and we use refuge trucks as well to get that message out. And also we held a series of events when we launched the campaign. We got local politicians, local community groups together, volunteers together to say, this is what we're doing, this is the message, will you support us? And it worked really, really well. And again, linking into the social media side of this, certainly looking back, we could have done more Facebook, Twitter, more on the websites, and I'm sure that that's something that when we start to renew the campaign for this year, that's something that we'll take into account. After the campaign, we need to measure if it was a success or not. Visits to the website increased threefold, fantastic. There was perception of behavioural changes, more people talked about it in more forums and local gatherings, local volunteers. When we interviewed people, they said that they could remember seeing something about it, and that's something new for us as well, because you can have a campaign 2 weeks later, people think, well, yeah, that was great, but you know, I'm moving on to something else now. I think that the thing that we're most proud of is the very prepared. We went from 49%, went to 49% from 39%. That's actually into the 70% now, because this is a bit of an old slide. And that's really, really good. It means that what we were doing was having an impact, people knew, and we were getting the right message through. Local flood plans increased, and people that register for flood warnings increased, but we're still not up to the target that we set ourselves. 46% is good. We need it to be much more than that, so that's still ongoing. And one of the things that I probably should have mentioned there, when you're talking about social media, and I think it's something that Rena said in the first presentation, I mentioned that our population retires to the Lincolnshire coastline, and she was talking about generation gaps. Not very helpful for us in Lincolnshire, because you know that's the age of most of our population, and they're probably not using Facebook and Twitter. So that is another challenge, but something that we have to take into account. And you can see there the line there, getting people out of danger while moving responders in and out of, is a challenge. The roads in Lincolnshire, anybody that's ever been to our part of the UK will know that we don't have any motorways. Well, we have one little stretch of motorway, and not very much more than that. I've talked about it being a very rural county and very agricultural, and I've talked about caravans. The main routes into all of those areas, if you're stuck behind caravans and tractors, it takes you some time to move anywhere around the county. And you can be driving for sometimes anything up to 30-40 minutes before you actually hit motorways in places of the county. So that's a challenge for us. And again, a lot of this work is more in Duncan's area on the road research things, but based on a 1 in 1,000 year event, we think based on the research it would take 30 hours to evacuate. 1 in 200 years, you can see 21 there, 21 hours to evacuate. Some of the work that we'd like to do in Lincolnshire, well in the UK as a whole, some of the road safety partnerships use what they call red route signage, so accidents where the roads that have a lot of accidents on them, they actually say the number of deaths and injuries, and it just makes people aware that where they're driving, you know, to take a little bit more care. What we want to try and do in the future is to have designated evacuation routes out of the county. And what we want to try and do is use the existing signs on those routes, because most of them are the same routes anyway. They're certainly on the gritting routes that we're using at the moment with the bad weather, and maybe flip signs. And this is some learning that came out of America actually as well. They use them very effectively over there. We think it's a great idea. Again, there's a bit of opposition at the moment because of tourism and the other reasons I mentioned before, but that's some ongoing work, something that we want to do. You can imagine again where the social media comes in. If we're trying to evacuate people through roads or on roads that aren't used to that volume of traffic, if people, and again looking at the examples that I've seen this afternoon, that people are already using social media, we need to manage misinformation. You can imagine if somebody's saying a road is blocked or you can't use this road, and you can, or they're sending people down a clear road because there's not many vehicles on it, but that's because we've designated an emergency services route into the affected area. Not exactly helpful. The way that we use or monitor social media at the moment in emergencies is our resilience forum have a warning informing group. That warning informing group is responsible for putting out, well, media liaison really on a multi-agency basis, just sharing information, putting one messages out on behalf of all the agencies responding. We now have people that monitor the social media sites, Facebook and Twitter as well. And what we try and do is all the official channels of putting out information, again, we put them out through those avenues, but we'd make sure that it was an agreed message before we did it, the same way as we'd issue a press statement really. But I mean, gone are the days now where you can say, right, something happens and there's going to be a press conference in 2 hours. You've lost the initiative by that anyway, haven't you? You need to act further than that. And again, I mentioned the generation gap that I wanted to mention again there. So, and again, this is a quick whistle-stop tour of this. This is some of the research that Duncan undertook. This map here shows our flood risk areas. The stars represent the first real access point away from those areas. So you can see in Lincolnshire, you know, you've got to go some distance sometimes from the coastline before you hit decent roads out of the county. And it's not always, it's okay, us in Lincolnshire doing this, that this is where you hit the roads and you go up to the north or out or down the south. To the north of us is Humberside area. We're actively encouraging them to do the same piece of research, because if we're sending all of our traffic up into their motorway network, there's likely to be congestion elsewhere. So it all needs to be interlinked, and it needs to be done on a regional basis. The other map here this is actually Boston, one of the market towns in Lincolnshire. And this is road usage. The wider the line is the more usage. So you can see that our road structure is not exactly fantastic. And you know, 30 hours to totally evacuate, could we achieve it? We don't want to find out, do we? But I mean, it's a big ask, isn't it? Hidden communities in Lincolnshire. I've mentioned that we have 24,000 caravans in Lincolnshire. They're mostly holiday homes, but increasingly we find that people are living in them all year round. Some of those people that are living in them all year round probably don't want you to know that they're living in them all year round because of taxes, issues and all sorts of things. It is quite a big problem. But how do we communicate with those people if you don't know that you're there? If you don't know that they're there. I mentioned before about we've done some work with caravan site owners. You are reliant upon them then to communicate with the people that they've got there. But just over 6,500 class this as their main residence. And again, little or no perception of the actual threat. But the one thing about it is that 90% of those people have their own transport, so they fit into the final category of what we were saying earlier on, is that they'll self-evacuate if we can tell them where to go, tell them what they need to do. You know, be a good neighbour and take anybody else that's living either next door that hasn't got transport. It doesn't cause us too much of a problem because relatively few of them would need our help and assistance. This just illustrates a little bit more the points that I've just been making. This photograph here is one of the many caravan sites on the coastline. Sorry, Anna, no, you can't see that. There's normal housing around here, and it's pretty similar to lots of other caravan sites right along the coast. This is the same area. We had the area overflown using thermal imagery. So all of the green area, in fact, the caravans here tend to be the biggest and the most expensive. But all of the green area here, and this was done out of season, this is all areas that are occupied on that site. You know, that's the housing area, so that's all green. But look at how many people are actually in these caravan sites. And that's just one of many. It causes a problem. It causes a problem with how do we communicate with these people. One of the main areas that we've looked at in Lincolnshire is use of radio, and I was quite happy that, again, Rena was saying that it was the main source of information in times of emergency, because we have a very good working relationship with our local media, and it's certainly one of the main ways that we communicate. But you can see we have a big problem in Lincolnshire. Vulnerable people as well. Vulnerable people, quite a complex issue. Many of you will know that people are vulnerable in different emergencies. They're vulnerable for different types of emergency and at different times during an emergency. But it is a big problem. Our local resilience forum have undertaken some work around this subject and have actually got a multi-agency group together, because what we found when we started doing this, that every organisation has a group of vulnerable people. So for Anglian Water, which is our water utility, our local water utility company, have a list of vulnerable people because it's things like kidney dialysis patients. They have to register, but they're vulnerable. Our health service has a list of vulnerable people for different reasons. Fire and rescue do. Local authorities has lists of vulnerable people. Social services, children's services, there are loads. But there's also a data protection issue with sharing information. So it's not something that you can map. because people won't allow it to be mapped, and you can imagine that there's all sorts of issues with that, because you can't go around telling people where vulnerable properties are for obvious reasons. What this group do now in times of emergency is they come together and they share information about that particular emergency. And the way that it works is it's based on postcode areas. So we define the postcode area of the emergency, and then it's a collective call to all of these groups, and they share which premises are vulnerable. It's a big piece of work for us because, as I said earlier on, it's where most of our resources are going to go. Those that can self-evacuate, we want them to get away, we want them to go, all our resources will be put into assisting people that are either vulnerable and need our assistance. If in the case of Lincolnshire, bearing in mind the other figures that we said straight at the start, that equates to about 40,000 people, which include vulnerable people, and it includes people that need our assistance. So, they might not have transport, they might be elderly and need our assistance. 40,000 people is an awful lot of people to assist in a time of emergency. Our new evacuation planning takes this into account. And we used to operate 6 hubs, that we get people to a place of safety, and then we get people to a longer term place of safety where we can transfer them on. If we're talking about 40,000 people, they're going to go all over the country, really. And if it's an East Coast event, we'll be vying for premises the same as Rosanna will be. But we've now put it down to 2. The reason that we've got 2 centres is we knew, because of exercise watermark, that we can't resource 6. It's totally impossible for us to resource 6 of these centres because they're so big with the volume of people that are going through them. We now have 1 evacuation centre in the north and 1 in the south. And they're quite away from the coast. They're about 40 miles from the coast. We don't see it being too much of a problem. If you're going to get somebody to a place of centre safety, what's another 20 minutes? The fact that we move them inland means that they're not at risk of any flooding. It's good for our mutual aid requirements. So if resources are coming in from the East Midlands, it means that the road structure is better. We're not clogging the roads up on the coastline. We're not trying to get resources into already congested areas. And we can get all of our resources marshalled there. Health and social care resources. And we can then almost spend some more time with people, and we can take to the details and find out where they need to go for longer term. For the research, we interviewed a cross-section of 192 people, and they were really from target groups, so people with disabilities, people with learning difficulties, carers, and over 65. So that gives you an idea of what I mean in this particular context of vulnerable people. But a huge piece of work and something that is ongoing. Coordinating volunteers. In Lincolnshire, we have a memorandum of understanding with the British Red Cross. And that was done through our local resilience forum. The British Red Cross coordinate all of our volunteer agencies. So if we have an emergency, we need any sort of volunteers, not just Red Cross. They will look after everything, coordinate everything. And you can see some of the things that they do there. You can imagine if it's a flooding situation, then we'd probably have lots of people with boats saying, I can come and help you, I've got a boat, I'll meet you at such and such. Probably not such a fantastic idea. We don't know whether it's seaworthy. There's all sorts of problems with that. It's almost something that can be taken away from the already busy emergency services and something that the Red Cross will look after. Again, you can imagine with an emergency of this nature, we'd have an awful lot of convergent volunteers, people that just say, I want to help, what can I do? I don't mind doing anything, but what can I do? People volunteer for different reasons, and you know, some are better than others. Having an organisation that can almost sift those volunteers, make sure that the skills are appropriate and the people are appropriate, is something that's fantastically useful for us. And again, if we need further mutual aid, they've got contact with other volunteer agencies from around the country, and they can coordinate that for us. Exercise Watermark, large national exercise actually on flooding, but in Lincolnshire we used that exercise to test all of our planning assumptions. We actually did undertake a partial evacuation of Sutton-on-Sea, which is quite a large village on the coast. We physically evacuated lots of volunteers from there. We had all of our organisations involved. You can see there that our flood wardens, which are local groups that go out to warn and inform, were involved. We ran our county emergency centre, so we also had a tabletop exercise as well. And we learned a great deal from it. It's something that we'd like to do every year if we could, but again, resources and funding commitments mean that that's not always possible. But something that was a fantastic exercise for us and something that we learned a great deal from. So next step for us, and I did say earlier on that this is a work in progress. We don't profess that we've hit all of our 7 objectives for that shared ambition. We're looking at some more funding for more work to do with caravan sites and how we communicate with people and how we communicate with caravan site owners. We want to work with agriculture and horticulture. We've run several exercises for some of the groups that we have in our LRF. As I said, Lincolnshire is a massive rural county. If we lost 20% of food production, it's got a huge impact for the UK as a whole. And certainly a lot of farmers in the county with livestock, an awful lot of livestock in the county are going to go out of business and probably never ever recover from that. So we are trying to get them more involved in the planning process. 1953 anniversary, 60th anniversary this year of the 1953 floods, and talking with Rosanna just before this presentation, 30th and 31st of January is the commemorations of those events, and church services, visits, all sorts of things that happen in the local communities. Our Community Resilient Engagement Officer has done quite a lot of work with survivors and people that were involved in the 53 flooding. And we've put some publications out about that. Many of those have been involved in the commemorative celebrations that are happening in a couple of weeks' time. But when you look at some of the stories there, that I think there's certainly a couple of Hollywood blockbuster films in some of those, certainly a couple of the stories that I've heard. But I think I'd like to say that you know, it is still a work in progress. We've got a long way to go for a problem that's never going to go away, and we've still got some objectives to meet as well. That concludes the presentation. I'm happy to take some questions if you do have any, but if you do want any more information, that's my email address, and I'm happy to respond.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.